Well, good morning. Hey, before we jump in today, I want to echo what Scott talked about, and thank you if you joined us yesterday for our community garden work day. We got some stuff accomplished, so great job, guys. Give yourself a round of applause. We spread a ton of wood chip. We worked our butts off a little bit. It was actually nice weather. And then we had some awesome youth and students helping us out. They asked if they could get a pay raise halfway through, and I said, I will double your salary to free to more than free. But we got some great stuff done, and it was awesome. And we actually put even seed in the ground, got our irrigation done. So hopefully we'll see some stuff starting to grow out of there. Yeah. But there was something that didn't go to plan. Because you also see we saw piles of rock. And in the morning, we actually had a tractor come, and he was like, I got this. I'm going to start spreading this, and you can come back through with the rake, and it'll be all great. And then all of a sudden, the tractor didn't work. So we jumped in, we got it started, and then something else broke, and we're looking at it, we're like, yeah, that's not going to happen today. And then one of our guys who was at our event, he's like, I can go get a Bobcat. I know a guy, and he'll let us use it. So we go, and he gets the Bobcat, and it takes a process, and he works it for about 30 minutes, and then guess what happens? The Bobcat died. And I'm like, God, we had this all planned out. We had this in tow. We're like, man, we've been working on this project. We've been praying about this project for years. We've been working on this for months. And I was like, the trees come in on the 8th. We're having a work day on the 9th. We're going to make this thing beautiful, and the landscape happens. And then it didn't go according to my plan. And I'm like, God, what's going on here? God, why is it like we had it all lined up? We dotted our I's, we crossed our T's. Everything should have been beautiful and great. But sometimes, man, maybe we don't get the full picture. Sometimes we don't know why things happen the way they do. Well, today we get a great example of that, and we are starting a new series through the book of Esther. If you have a Bible, you can go ahead and open it up, flip there, or pull open our notes in the YouVersion Bible app. But we're going to be in week 1 of 5 weeks where we're studying this book. And as we do it, I think it comes at an appropriate time, because this is a book where a lot of things happening. And you probably read this and you're like, God, why are you letting this happen? God, why isn't there just more like just intentional, this just like, let's skip this part. Why are you letting this leader be here? Or why are these bad things happening to God's people? And sometimes we can get into this trap of falling like, God, are you really there? Why did you let this happen? Why did you let the tractor or the Bobcat die? Why did you let 2020 happen? And why when 2020 happened and it flipped over to 2021, it didn't fix everything, but it seemed like it got worse. Like it said, hold my drink, and like it got worse. And it's like, why is all this going on? Well, let me give you a statement that I believe is kind of an accurate series overview. And today we're going to look at chapter 1, but as we look at chapter 1, I kind of want to give you a little bit of overview of the whole story here. And here's a series overview that I think we're going to kind of dive into and look at today, that the story of Esther gives us a beautiful picture of the sovereignty of God and our role in his grand narrative. You see, when I say that word sovereignty of God, that refers to the power and control that God has over our worlds. Actually, we hear about this in Romans 8:28. This is a verse that maybe you've heard before, that says that we know that all things work together for the good of those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. Now, maybe you've heard that, but you've then lived life, and you're like, well, it seems like some bad stuff is happening. Like, well, I thought it was supposed to work towards good, and it just seems like bad. Like, when's the good gonna come? But you see, Esther is a story that's actually kind of a case study of this verse. And when things were bad, like really bad, as we're going to read over these next words, and people were doing bad stuff, that God is still in control, and that God still has a plan. And like I said, if you look at our world today, things are still pretty bad. I was hoping that in 2021, it was kind of going to be like the Wizard of Oz, right? Like where everything's in black and white, and then go to Oz, and then all of a sudden everything's in color, and it's fantastic. And I was hoping when we turn the year, that's a little bit how it'd be. But then last week happens. And on Wednesday, It was rough. On Wednesday, we saw an ugly side of our culture and of our country like we've seen for the past 6 months. And tensions have continued to rise. Divisions have continued to rise. We've continued to see riots from both extreme sides, and there's just this animosity, this angst in our country. So where do we find the hope when it seems like our world's on fire? When it seems like we don't see God working behind the scenes? Well, it comes from God, and we have a role in showing our world that hope. So let's jump in today as we go through chapter 1 of Esther. And I want to dissect this Esther story kind of like we're in a high school language class. You ready for that? We're going to look at the 5 elements of a story. You're like, what in the world is happening right now? We're going to have fun with it. But we're going to start this, and we're going to look at one of the most important elements of a story, and that is the characters. You see, in the book of Esther, there are 5 main characters that the story really builds upon. And the first we have is this king named Cyrus. There's a lot of different ways to say his name, and it's crazy. I looked up like 10 different pronunciations, and I'm not good at it. But Azarias is one of it. In verse 1 through 2, let's read this. It says this, that these events took place during the days of Azarias, who ruled 127 provinces from India to Cush. In those days, King Azarias reigned from his royal throne in the fortress at Susa. Now let me stop right there and give you a little background here. This king is also known in history by the name of Xerxes. And he was actually the great Persian Empire, known as one of the greatest conquerors in human history. And he conquered every land he sought out, with the exception of Greece. And you're like, man, I know that. You know why you know that? Because you've watched 300, okay? You're like, oh, now I understand. This is the same guy. I mean, he probably was a little different than in the movie. Like, I don't think he was giant, like stepped on slaves, but who knows? But it's this guy who we've read stories about and we've heard about. This is this great conqueror who there's a story of 300 Spartans fighting out thousands, and some say 10 to 100,000 of his soldiers. At one point, Xerxes actually amassed an army of over 2 million soldiers. Now, this is the guy, despite this depiction of him and what we hear throughout history, he was a pretty brutal conqueror. Some consider him a great leader. But throughout the book of Esther, Azarias is what I would call an emotional addict. He drinks, he parties, he demands what he wants, he throws a fit when he doesn't get it, and then he finds people that ultimately give him the answers he wants. You see, this is not a level-headed and consistent character, but this seems to live off his emotions, to make decisions based on how drunk he is or how emotional he is at the time, and ultimately who is whispering in his ear. Which leads to our next character of Vashti. Check out verse 9. It says, Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women of King Azarias' palace. Now we're going to talk about the feast that they had in just a second, but Vashti was a queen. And you see, her decision early in this book will actually lead to her disappearance, but also an opportunity for other characters to come into the story. But you see, for her, she is the character that if you read a story or movie that you got to write off early in order to open the door for someone to come in. Like you watch a rom-com and it's like the ex that they got to break up with, and right away it's like, oh yeah, we're moving on from you, so then the new character, and then they can have a love story. Or a horror movie, it's like who you kill off first, and then it opens the door for, whatever else to come in. Vashti is here, she makes a decision, and then she's going to be gone real quick. And now that leads to the good characters, interesting one of those being Mordecai. In chapter 2, verse 5 is when we're first introduced to him. And it says, in the fortress of Susa, there was a Jewish man named Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjamite. Now you see, Mordecai is actually the first Jew, a first person of God who is mentioned in this story. And he, how I would describe him, if we have kind of Xerxes, the emotional addict, Vashti, the early write-off, he is the mentor. He is the one who inspires, who gives direction. He is the, Rafiki or the Mushu or the genie in the story. I watch a lot of Disney Plus. I have children. I'm sorry, that's all I could think of when I thought of mentors. But he is the guy that has all this wisdom, and he gives this direction to Esther. Chapter 2, verse 15, we're introduced to Esther for the first time. It says, Esther was the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had adopted her as his own daughter. When her turn came to go to the king, she did not ask for anything except what Hegai, the king's eunuch, keeper of the women, suggested. But listen to this verse. Esther gained favor in the eyes of everyone who saw her. You see, she is the protagonist. She is the hero, the good guy or the good girl of the story. She is the one that the book is written after. She is the one that is kind of the leading character we see and we hear about. And Esther actually provides the great heroic moments of this story that we're going to read over these next few weeks. But you see, these heroic moments are needed because of our last main character, and that is Haman. And he is the villain of the story. Chapter 3, verse 1, it says, after all this took place, King Ahasuerus honored Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite. He promoted him in rank and gave him a higher position than all the other officials. Now, Haman is like I said, the antagonist, the villain. My 2-year-old son, Archie, when he watches this show, he likes to say the bad guy, right? Like he watches Toy Story, and if you watch Toy Story 2, Uncle Pete, the prospector, or Stinky Pete, he is the bad guy, and he'll stare at him, and he's watched the movies, and he's like, or he like points, he said, that's the bad guy, and I'm like, you know it, like it's going to get rough for him. But that's Haman in the story. He is the villain. And it's crazy we aren't introduced to him until chapter 3, but this will ultimately be the villain of the story. Now, you may hear all this and you may think, like, why does it matter about all these characters? Why are you introducing this at the top? Well, here's why I named all these people, because here's kind of a thought that I think kind of we need to drill in, and a lesson we learn from this, that the characters of Esther shows how God uses imperfect people like us to further his will. God uses messed up, imperfect people like us to do his will. I want you to remember these names over the next 5 weeks as we study this, of Ahasuerus and Vashti, of Mordecai, of Esther and Haman, because these are all super messed up people. Even the good ones have baggage. As we go through, we're going to see some are drunks, some are defiant, some are looking for a fight when we don't know if they really should look for a fight, some are well-meaning but still sinful in what they're being well-meaning for, and some are just straight evil. But despite all this, God uses them in some way to accomplish his plan. Man, I hear all the time when I have conversations with people, especially with brokenness in their past, they're like, yeah, I know church sounds great, and I know I should get closer to God, but God can't use me. Like, that's why I just sit in a service and kind of fade to the dark, or that's why I just watch online, or that's why I fill in the blank, because my past, what I've been through, I'm kind of messed up. God can't use me. But you see, what we see in Scripture, and we see in the book of Esther, is God uses all of us when we have baggage. All of us when we're messed up, when we don't have everything together, and maybe we pretend like we have things together on the outside, but God knows what's truly in our hearts. And what I love is what we see in this book is that it's not even a question if God will use you. He will use you. But the question becomes, what side are we being used for? Are we on the right side of God's will or the wrong one? Which leads to the setting that we're going to look at next. Chapter 1, if you flip back there, we're going to read the first 9 verses in chapter 1. And this is going to really get us into the story and see the setting of the story in this grand way. It says this, that these events took place during the days of Ahasuerus, who ruled 127 provinces from India to Kush. In those days, King Ahasuerus reigned from his royal throne in the fortress at Susa. Listen to this, it's going to get crazy. He held a feast in the 3rd year of his reign for all his officials and staff, the army of Persia and Media, the nobles and the officials from the provinces. He displayed the glorious wealth of his kingdom and the magnificent splendor of his greatness for a total of 180 days. He threw a party for 6 months, all right? Verse 5, better. At the end of this time, the king held a week-long banquet in the garden courtyard of the royal palace for all the people, from the greatest to the least, who were present in the fortress of Susa. White and violet linen hanging were fastened with fine white and purple linen cords to silver rods on marble columns. Gold and silver couches were arranged on a mosaic pavement, or red feldspar, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. My couch gets a lot of dog fur on it. I just need a gold or marble couch, and I think we'd be fine. That's what I heard from that. Verse 7, drinks were served in an array of gold goblets, each with a different design. You didn't have to find your drink at this party. You knew which one was yours because yours was that one with the special design because there was nothing. They didn't use red Solo cups. They used gold goblets, okay? Crazy. Royal wine flowed freely according to the king's bounty. The drinking was according to a royal decree. There are no restrictions. The king had ordered every wine steward in his household to serve whatever each person wanted. And then it says, verse 9, that Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women of King Azarias' palace. You see, the book of Esther takes place about 100 years after God's people went into exile. They got captured by this country or this nation called Babylon. And then Babylon got overthrown by Persia. And when we land in Esther, we are at Xerxes' reign, which takes place somewhere between 483 and 465 BC. And we're in the capital city of this great empire, Susa. And you see, Azarias, a.k.a. Xerxes, he invited all the important people to come to his place and, like we said, to have a 6-month-long party. 6 months. I don't know about you, but that's a little bit long to me. And apparently, they had so much alcohol left that they needed to do a 7-week after party where they invited the entire kingdom. Now, I'm on a little bit different length here. On New Year's Eve, my wife and I had a small party, and we invited a few friends over. We played categories, and we played, Mexican train dominoes. It got heated. We got angry at each other, and we sent everyone home by 10 o'clock so we could go to bed, okay? 3 to 4 hours is my party. They did 6 months with a week-long after party. A little crazy here. But you see, in Esther, this is the backdrop we have of the story. And here's what's important, because this drunken party kingdom of something we can't even imagine, it's funny because it's popular today for Christians to be like, our world is just so messed up. That our world is so bad. It's never been this bad before. We've never experienced anything like this. Our morals are going away from God. And there's some truth to that. We've declined in some moral areas for sure. But when we say it has never been this bad, just read the Bible. This was unlike anything we've ever experienced in our country. This leader was just a drunken mess and using his power and authority any way he wanted. And you see, God has worked in worse areas than us before. And I believe that the learning we get from the setting of Esther, that the setting of Esther shows us that we can never use our environment as an excuse to not be on the right side of God's plan. You see, Esther and Mordecai could have been like, do you see Xerxes? The guy has 2 million soldiers. He is a drunk. He won't listen to anyone. He's crazy. He's dumb. This world is so messed up. They worship other gods. They are into some crazy stuff. I'm out, God. I'm not going to be a part of this. I'm just going to slip in the shadows. I'm going to keep my mouth closed, and I'm not going to try to do anything. But instead, God put on their hearts, no. We got to move towards action. And they allowed God to use him, which leads to the plot of the story. Check out verse 10. It says, on the 7th day, when the king was feeling good from the wine, okay? He was probably feeling good just on the 7th day. That was the 7th day after the 6 months and then the week. He was probably feeling good that entire time. But Azarias commanded, this is all his little eunuch bros, Mehuman, Biztha, Harbonah, Bigtha, Agatha, Zathar, and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who personally served him, okay? He ordered them, verse 11, to bring Queen Vashti before him with her royal crown. He wanted to show off her beauty to the people and the officials because she was very beautiful. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command that was delivered by his eunuchs. The king became furious, and his anger burned within him. You see, the plot can be defined in a book as the actual story itself with a clear beginning, middle, and end. And you see, this story of Esther starts when the king was loaded up on booze, when he was drunk out of his mind, and he calls his queen, his wife, to be a showpiece. And this is one example in Esther of numerous throughout the story where we see people trying to play God. You see, we see people trying to exert their authority, trying to show their sovereignty, all while truly being a slave to their own sin. You see, Azarias constantly tries to display his authority throughout this book. But we see this with other characters as well. Vashti displays hers with trying to say no, although it doesn't end well for her, and trying to be dominant and put her foot down. Mordecai will defy laws. Haman will try to get others killed for his gain. And even Esther herself will compromise morals to move into positions of power. But you see, this is also important because with this power struggle and attempts to exert their authority to control their own fate, God's plan keeps on moving on. And you see, I think the plot of Esther, another key learning that we get, shows that God is always in control, even when we don't see him. You see, the book of Esther has one very unique quality about it. And maybe you've heard this before, but it is different than any other book in the Bible, in that it is the only book that does not say the name of God. And not only does it not say the name of God, it doesn't say Lord, it doesn't allude to him in any way, it doesn't say they praised him or anything like that. There is no mention of God whatsoever in this book. And you see in here, in the book of Esther, I think it's fitting that the plot seems to be all about different people trying to scheme their way to get their desired outcome, when the whole time God is silently working behind the scenes. I've mentioned that I have kids, and I have young kids, and one of the great things of young kids sometimes is they don't like to sleep at night, and they decide to cry, and it's just so fantastic to wake up to a crying child at 2 or 3 in the morning. I'm seeing my mom say, yep, and they're laughing right now, because they're like, no, it just happened last night. But my 4-year-old daughter, Aria, she's gone through a few seasons of some struggle in her sleep. And we have a crazy bedtime routine because I want them down by 7 so I can breathe, we can eat dinner, we can watch a TV or something. I'm like, you're going to bed right now. And we put them down, but she had this season where she was just rebelling like no other. She would be like, I don't want to go to bed. I'm like, well, you got to go to bed. You didn't take a nap today. You're grumpy. You're going to get worse. Like, I'm telling you, you need to go to bed. And she would just argue. And then she would finally be defiant, and she would sit at her door. Like, she would get out of bed and sit at her door and, open it and just, look out. And I'd, pass, and she'd be, watching me. I'm like, I'm not talking to you. We've already had this discussion, and you're not listening, so... Finally, I got to the point where I'm just going to ignore it. And I actually was saying this about something else, and someone asked me, you really ignore your kids when they're crying? I'm like, not all the time. But you got to sometimes just say, there's points where you're like, okay, I can't give in. So I would just let her sit there, and eventually, as she was staunch and she thought she was right, she thought she didn't need to go to bed, she would pass out on the floor. What was amazing is she would be staunch sitting there at her doorway, staring out, thinking she's right, but then she would wake up in the morning in bed, all snuggled up tight, and had a great night's sleep. Well, how did that happen? Well, because after she fell asleep on the floor, Dad would finally go by and say, oh, she's out. And sometimes she would block the door, so I'm putting my hand in, trying to push her back, and she's sleeping through all of it, and then open the door. But I pick her up real quietly, put her in bed, and cover her up. And you see, I think kind of like in the story of Esther, and kind of like in our lives, is we're like that toddler throwing a fit, saying my way is right, saying this is the path I'm going, I can control my destiny, when really we're just waiting to pass out and God redirecting us, and all this, and we're like, oh, that was a really nice sleep, but I thought I fell asleep on the floor. And you see, God works in crazy ways. And even though we don't hear God in this story, even though his name is not said, he is working everything for the good of his people according to his purpose, which leads to the conflict of the story. You see, after we read here that he calls Queen Vashti to come and she refuses him and he becomes furious, he gets his wise men together. And by wise men, they were actually afraid of their wives and sad excuses for men. And they tell the king, Xerxes, they say, you need to make an example of your wife So all of our wives don't turn on us as well, is really what they're saying. And in chapter 1, verse 19, this is the decision that Xerxes makes. It says, if it meets the king's approval, he should personally issue a royal decree. Let it be recorded in the laws of Persia and Media so that it cannot be revoked. Vashti is not to enter King Azariah's presence, and her royal position to be given to another woman who is more worthy than she. Verse 20, the decree the king issues will be heard throughout his vast kingdom, so all women will honor their husbands from the greatest to the least. As I was reading this, I was kind of reminded of when I was in junior high. And in junior high, I liked this girl in our youth group who was in high school. And we had become good friends, and finally, at youth camp, I mustered up the courage. I'm like, I'm going to ask her out, right? And she knew I liked her, and I asked her out, and what did she do? She very nicely rejected me. She's like, I'm in high school, you're a junior high kid, even though you're great looking, this just is not going to work at this time. That wasn't a joke. Okay. But she rejected me, and we were good friends, and we had a friend group, and I remember telling her, I am saying, well, since we can't date, I don't think we can be friends anymore. I like you so much so that if you don't want to date, we're done. We're cut off. And my brother took me aside after. He's like, are you a moron? And I'm like, what? Yes, I was in junior high. And he said, are you a moron? He said, you like this girl so much that now you don't want to be around her at all just because she doesn't want to enter into a relationship, which you're in junior high was even going to be in anyway. And it's like, this is actually the same childish behavior that we see from the king here. He's like, I want you in my presence. I want you to come see me. Oh, you don't want to come see me? I never want to see you again. And this is kind of the crazy emotional, drunken decisions that we see in this story. And when we read here, it's just so funny that we see this drunken mess of this man Xerxes who's made this decision. And this is what it finally leads to here. In verse 21, it says this, that the king and his counselors, they approved the proposal. And he followed Memucan's advice. He sent letters to all the royal provinces, to each province in his own script, and to each ethnic group in its own language, that every man should be a master of his own house and speak in the language of his people. Here's where we see the conflict of Esther, that he creates this unhealthy, this male-dominated society that treats women as property, completely contradictory to what God had created. Now, I think a little side note on here is something I kind of, as I was studying and reading this passage, that Persia had been operating in this way a long time. They had been running their households this way. But what was happening in the family dynamic and what was happening behind the scenes eventually bled over into the legal and actually became law in that culture that started in the family, infected the rest of the nation. And I think sometimes as Americans, we think about this, we think about backwards. We're like, if we just put the law, we're going to fix the rest of the world. It's like, no, let's fix our families and the law will come next. We fix our family units and we'll start a movement that changes our society. Sorry, I'm on a little soapbox there. But throughout the book of Esther, we see this conflict. And when this conflict arises from the drunken actions to the emotional decisions of these evil leaders like Haman and Xerxes, I think we can see that the conflict of Esther teaches us, and what we can learn is that there will always be enemies against God's people. We said earlier that God isn't mentioned in Esther, but funny enough, Satan isn't mentioned either. But you can be sure he was still working behind the shadows. And in this book of Esther, as this kind of conflict starts, we see that he was working behind the scenes in the story to push people in certain directions, to begin this conflict that God's people would come to. And no matter what country or culture we live in, there will always be opposition, there will always be conflict, and there will all be enemies to God and his plan. But here's the encouragement this morning, is that this ultimately leads to the fact that in this book we do see resolution. Now, if you flip to the very end of Esther in chapter 10, and I'm going to kind of break a rule of we go through a story, I'm just going to give you the end first. Like, we just went on Wikipedia and read how the movie ends, and then we're going to go back in and see how we got there. But in chapter 10, starting in verse 1, we see the resolution that comes to in this book, and it says this, that King Azarias imposed a tax throughout the land, even to the farthest shores. All of his powerful and magnificent accomplishments and the detailed account of Mordecai's great rank, which the king had honored him, have they not been written in the book of the historical events of the kings of Media and Persia? Verse 3, Mordecai the Jew was second only to King Azarias. He was famous among the Jews, and he was highly esteemed by many of his relatives. He continued to pursue prosperity for his people and to speak for the well-being of all his descendants. You see, the book of Esther actually begins with showcasing the greatness of Persia and the greatness of the king and the emperor that was in charge. And it ended up leading to one point to the threatening of God's people. And it actually was at a point where there was a death decree to all of God's people put out because of that. But then the book ends with showcasing the greatness of Mordecai and the celebration of God's people. And you see, there is this great reversal that happens in the book of Esther. And as we go on this journey, we're going to see that what was meant for evil and this evil path that they went down, that God reversed all that, and it worked out for his people in the end. But you see, this last learning that I think we see from this is that the resolution of Esther shows us that God and his people will always be vindicated in the end. That no matter what's happening in our world, maybe it doesn't mean our country will be vindicated, but God's people, his church will. And God's people will be shown through. And when you look around the culture around us and you're like, man, people are dumb. Man, our world is crazy. Man, this isn't looking like it's going to go a good path. That God is still in control. And God is leading us in the direction he knows. But here's the question that I want to land on today and to close us with. Is what led to that vindication? What led to those events turning in favor of God's people? And I actually think the turning point of this story is in chapter 4. Because in chapter 4, we actually finish out chapter 3, and in the very last statement of chapter 3 is that the city of Susa was in confusion. That there was a death decree that had been sent out for all of God's people, every Jew in the land, that they knew things weren't going to go well. And the city was literally in confusion. But in Esther chapter 4, starting in verse 1, here's what it says, that when Mordecai learned all that had occurred, he tore his clothes, he put on sackcloth and ashes, he went into the middle of the city, and he cried loudly and bitterly. He went only as far as the king's gate, since the law prohibited anyone wearing sackcloth from entering the king's gate. And there was great mourning among the Jewish people in every province where the king's command and edict came. And listen to this, they fasted, they wept, they lamented, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. You see, in this time, sackcloth and ashes was actually a sign of humility and repentance and turning back to God. And you see here, even though it doesn't say God in this passage, that they were still turning back to him. They were following the old rituals that they had got passed down from their people about how do we realign themselves back to the God they know. And when we reflect on the state of our nation today, I think what we've seen and we've talked about is we need revival in our land. But here's the thing about revival, is it starts right here. It starts with us as individuals. We like to pray, God, can you just change everything? Can you just have all the churches rise up? Can you change the culture? God, can you take back the decree? Can you knock Xerxes off his throne? God, can you do amazing things? Instead, God told Mordecai, I need to weep, I need to fast, and I need to pray to my God that he changed me to use me in his story. Now, I'm going to challenge you to do two things today. One is Josh is going to continue to play, and the band is going to come up here, and as they play, That wherever you're sitting online, at home, or in your chair here in the room, that you pray for revival to start in your life. That no longer we just complain about all the craziness that's happening in our world, but we ask God, how can you change me? And how can you work in my life today? And then my second step for that is this week I have a challenge for you. That every Wednesday, through the book of Esther, as we do this 5-week series, I want to challenge everyone who's watching or part of Cross Church is you start your morning and you start it on your knees in prayer. And you pray for our nation, you pray for our leaders, you pray for our churches, but that you continue that prayer of revival in your own life. And then from there, after you say that prayer, from morning until night, that we fast and depend on God like we haven't before. Now, fasting can be fasting from food. It can be throwing your phone out the window. It can be punching your TV. It can be whatever you need it to be. But that during that time of Wednesday, from breakfast to dinner, that we spend that time devoted, dependent, in praying to our God. And here's what we may see. Here's what I'm praying that we see, is that a revival can burn in our personal lives. And as we read the story of Esther, that we see that, man, we may be messed up, but God can still use us to further his plan. Let's pray this morning.